My evil mother-in-law poisoned me while I was pregnant, and my husband tossed me into the lake, thinking I was gone forever. But I survived, losing my baby in the process. While they celebrated my death, I returned, alive and furious. Their joy turned to terror as I delivered a shocking revenge they never saw coming. My name is Sophia Williams. If someone had told me 5 years ago that my life would turn into a battlefield of love, betrayal, and resilience, I would have laughed. Back then, I was a 28-year-old chef, full of dreams and optimism. I had a vision of opening my own restaurant, blending Napa Valley's vibrant flavors with my culinary creations. Little did I know, life had a recipe of its own, one filled with bitterness I couldn't have imagined. It all started when I met Daniel. He was everything I ever wanted: handsome, kind, and ambitious. At 30, he had a thriving career as an architect, designing breathtaking homes across the region. We met at a winery event where I was catering. Our connection was instant. He admired my passion for food. I admired his artistry in creating spaces where people could live and love. Within a year, we were married, and I moved into his family estate in the picturesque Napa Valley. Life seemed perfect at first. The estate was sprawling, surrounded by endless vineyards that shimmered under the California sun. I was welcomed by Daniel's mother, Margaret Williams, a 58-year-old retired businesswoman who had an air of elegance and authority. She seemed polite at the beginning, even warm. I thought I had found not just a husband, but a family. But the cracks began to show soon after the wedding. Margaret's politeness turned into subtle criticism. She would comment on my cooking, saying things like, "Daniel grew up on refined tastes. You should adjust to what he's used to." Or she'd offer advice on running a household, which sounded more like commands. At first, I brushed it off. I thought, she's just protective of her son. It'll get better. It didn't. Margaret's influence over Daniel became more apparent with time. I noticed how he leaned on her for decisions, even small ones, and how her opinion always seemed to outweigh mine. Whenever we argued, Margaret would somehow find a way to join in, taking Daniel's side. Slowly but surely, I felt like an outsider in my own marriage. Things got worse at family gatherings. Margaret had a way of making me feel small in front of others. She'd talk about her son's ex-girlfriends, how they were accomplished and came from good families. She'd make comments like, "Sophia, you're lucky Daniel chose you," as if I didn't deserve him. I started avoiding those gatherings, but that only gave her more ammunition. She'd tell Daniel, "Your wife is so disrespectful. She doesn't even care to join the family." I could see the seeds of doubt she planted in Daniel. He started questioning me more, doubting my decisions, and worst of all, pulling away emotionally. The man who once supported me in everything now looked at me through his mother's lens. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it would change everything. I believed a child could bridge the growing distance between us. For a brief moment, Daniel seemed thrilled. He held me close and promised me we'd be a family. Even Margaret congratulated us, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Looking back, I should have noticed the tension brewing beneath the surface. Margaret's hostility intensified after the announcement. She began insisting on taking control of everything related to the baby, appointments, nursery decisions, even my diet. "A baby needs proper care, Sophia. You've never been a mother before, so you need guidance," she'd say. Her guidance felt more like a takeover. Then came the whispers. Margaret started feeding Daniel fears about how the baby would change our lives. "A child is a huge responsibility," she told him one evening. "You two aren't ready for that. Your careers will suffer. Sophia doesn't even know what she's getting into." I overheard parts of their conversations, but Daniel would brush it off when I asked. "She's just worried about us," he'd say. "Don't overthink it." But I wasn't overthinking it. Something was deeply wrong. I started feeling unwell, nausea beyond normal morning sickness, constant fatigue, and sharp pains that alarmed me. Margaret dismissed my concerns, saying it was all part of pregnancy. Daniel agreed with her, and I didn't have the strength to argue. One evening, as I lay curled up in pain, I realized the truth. Margaret and Daniel were behind my suffering. It wasn't normal pregnancy symptoms. It was something far darker. I pieced it together. Margaret's sudden interest in preparing my meals, her insistence that I eat her homemade remedies for nourishment. The betrayal hit me like a cold wave. My own husband and his mother were poisoning me to end my pregnancy. I lost my baby a week later. The pain was indescribable, not just physically, but emotionally. It wasn't just the loss of my child, it was the loss of trust, of love, of everything I thought I had with Daniel. As I lay in bed recovering, the fire inside me began to grow. I wasn't going to be their victim anymore. This wasn't just my story, it was the beginning of my transformation. A quiet resolve took root in me. They thought they had broken me, but they had no idea who I was becoming. After the miscarriage, everything inside me shattered. My body ached, my heart broke, and my spirit felt like it was crushed under the weight of betrayal. But as I lay there in the quiet of my room, staring at the ceiling, I realized something profound. I couldn't let this be the end. I couldn't let Margaret and Daniel win. I decided not to confront them right away. Instead, I pretended to be weak, compliant, and defeated. I went along with their narrative that the miscarriage was a tragic accident. Margaret offered her fake sympathies, patting my shoulder and saying, "These things happen, dear. You'll have another chance someday." I wanted to scream at her, to make her admit what she had done, but I knew better. They needed to believe I was broken. Daniel, too, was different. He barely looked at me, as if my grief made him uncomfortable. At times, I caught glimpses of guilt in his eyes, but it wasn't enough to make him confess. Margaret's grip on him was too strong. She had turned him into a man I didn't recognize, a man who could betray his wife in the worst possible way. In the days that followed, I started to plan. If Margaret and Daniel thought they had the upper hand, I would let them keep believing that, just long enough for me to turn the tables. I spent hours thinking, strategizing, and remembering every insult, every manipulation, every cruel word. I wouldn't act impulsively. I would make sure they felt the same pain I had endured, the same helplessness. To the outside world, I played the role of the grieving wife. I stayed quiet at family gatherings, barely spoke unless spoken to, and avoided Margaret as much as I could. But inside, I was burning with determination. One day, I came across an old box in the attic while cleaning. It was filled with my notebooks from culinary school. Flipping through the pages, I felt a spark of inspiration. Cooking had always been my escape, my passion. I decided I would use it to reclaim my power. Over the next few weeks, I immersed myself in my craft. I experimented with recipes, blending flavors in ways that expressed my emotions, bitterness, rage, and sorrow. I smiled when Margaret complimented my meals, unaware of the metaphorical meaning behind every dish. Cooking became my language of defiance, my way of regaining control. But food alone wasn't enough. I needed evidence of their betrayal, something undeniable. I began to observe them closely, pretending to go about my day as usual. I noticed the way Margaret and Daniel exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking, their hushed conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. I started leaving my phone in places where it could record their whispers, my heart pounding as I listened to the playback each night. It wasn't long before I had enough. Snippets of their plan to protect Daniel's future, conversations about my pregnancy being a mistake, and even Margaret's casual admission that she had taken care of things solidified what I already knew. The betrayal was real, and now I had proof. Despite the pain of hearing those recordings, they strengthened my resolve. I was no longer the naive woman who had moved into this house thinking I'd found a family. I was someone new, someone stronger, colder, and sharper. Then came the family vacation to Lake Tahoe, an annual tradition Margaret insisted on. Normally, I would have dreaded spending time in close quarters with her, but this year was different. I saw it as an opportunity. I packed my bags and my hidden evidence, ready to put my plan into motion. Lake Tahoe was beautiful, its crystal-clear waters and pine-covered hills offering a serene backdrop to the storm brewing within me. The family gathered at the cabin, laughing and chatting as if nothing had happened. Margaret was in her element, playing the gracious matriarch. Daniel was quieter than usual, though he still followed his mother's lead. During the trip, I began planting seeds of doubt among the family. I'd casually mention things Margaret had said to me, framing them as misunderstandings, but enough to make people wonder. I also started to befriend Daniel's cousin, Lisa, who had always been kind to me. Lisa had her own grievances with Margaret's controlling behavior, and it didn't take long to win her trust. By the end of the vacation, tensions were high. Margaret noticed the shift and tried to regain control, but I was already 10 steps ahead. On the final evening, during the big family dinner, I served a meal that would become the centerpiece of my revenge. The dish I prepared was a blend of bitter and sweet, layered with spices that mimicked the complexity of my emotions. Unbeknownst to Margaret and Daniel, it was laced with a non-lethal but potent ingredient that would cause hours of agony, symptoms eerily similar to what I had experienced during my miscarriage. As they ate, I watched them closely. The first signs of discomfort appeared on their faces. Margaret's smug smile faded, and Daniel's hand trembled as he reached for water. Inside, I felt a grim satisfaction. This was only the beginning. That night, as they writhed in pain, I confronted them for the first time. I didn't raise my voice or lash out. I simply stood there, calm and composed, as they looked at me with a mixture of confusion and fear. "How does it feel?" I asked softly. "To lose control? To feel helpless?" Their responses didn't matter. I had waited long enough. The storm had begun. The night of the dinner at Lake Tahoe marked the turning point. Watching Margaret and Daniel crumble before me was satisfying, but I knew my plan was far from over. I wanted justice. Not just for myself, but for the child they had stolen from me. It wasn't enough to make them suffer in private. The world needed to know the truth. After the poison meal left them doubled over in agony, Margaret and Daniel were rushed to the local hospital. Of course, I played the concerned wife and daughter-in-law, sitting quietly in the waiting room while the rest of the family panicked. I could see the suspicion in some of their eyes, especially Lisa's. She had noticed my calm demeanor and the subtle hints I had dropped during our conversations throughout the trip. I didn't mind. I had planned for this. The next morning, Margaret and Daniel were discharged with no lasting harm but plenty of discomfort and confusion. The doctors called it acute food poisoning, and no one pressed further. They returned to the cabin, weary and embarrassed, while I prepared the next step in my plan. I had waited months to confront them properly, but it wasn't going to happen in private. No, this confrontation needed an audience. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room for a final night together, I brought out the evidence I had been collecting for months. My heart raced as I walked into the room, but I kept my face neutral, almost serene. "Everyone," I began, holding up a small flash drive, "I think it's time we clear the air." Margaret's eyes narrowed, and Daniel's face paled. "Sophia," he said cautiously, "what are you talking about?" I ignored him and plugged the flash drive into the television. The screen lit up with the first recording, a conversation between Margaret and Daniel discussing my pregnancy. The words were crystal clear, Margaret saying, "This baby will ruin everything. She's already a distraction for you, Daniel. We need to handle this." The room fell silent. Gasps filled the air as the recording continued, revealing their plan to poison me and end the pregnancy. Margaret's voice was cold and calculating, and Daniel's hesitant responses did nothing to shield him from the blame. When the recording ended, I turned to face them. Margaret's usually composed expression was gone, replaced by sheer panic. "This is absurd," she shouted, rising from her chair. "You've manipulated these recordings, Sophia. You're trying to turn my family against me." Daniel looked as though he wanted to disappear. He didn't deny anything, and his silence only made the evidence more damning. The family erupted into whispers, their disbelief quickly turning to anger. "Is this true, Daniels?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "Did you really do this to Sophia?" He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, Margaret tried to regain control of the situation, her voice rising. "You don't understand. I was protecting my son." She was tearing him apart, dragging him down. "Enough," I snapped, my voice cutting through the chaos. Everyone turned to me. For the first time, I let the full weight of my anger show. You don't get to play the victim, Margaret. You poisoned me. You killed my child. And you, I said, turning to Daniel, stood by and let her do it. You betrayed me in the worst possible way. Tears streamed down my face as I spoke, but my voice didn't waver. I loved you, Daniel. I believed in us, in our future, and you destroyed it because you couldn't stand up to her. Daniel finally broke. I didn't know it would go this far, he mumbled. I thought she just wanted to. To what? I interrupted. Control me? Hurt me? You knew what she was doing, and you let it happen. The room was deathly silent. No one came to Margaret's defense, not even her closest allies. Lisa stood and walked to my side, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. Sophia, she said softly, you're not alone in this. We all see the truth now. Margaret's reign over the family was crumbling before her eyes. She screamed, denied everything, and tried to shift the blame, but it was no use. The recordings were undeniable. The family, once bound by loyalty, was now united in their condemnation of her actions. As for Daniel, he was a broken man. He sat silently, his head in his hands, as the weight of his choices crushed him. For the first time, I saw the guilt he had been hiding, but it didn't make me feel better. It was too little, too late. That night, I packed my bags. I had no intention of staying another moment in that house with those people. Before I left, I handed a letter to Lisa. Make sure everyone reads this, I said. They need to understand why I'm leaving. The letter detailed everything: the betrayal, the pain, and my decision to start over. I didn't want pity or apologies. I wanted freedom, and I was finally ready to take it. As I drove away from Lake Tahoe, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, I was free of Margaret's control and Daniel's betrayal. I had faced them, exposed the truth, and reclaimed my power. But my journey wasn't over yet. I still had a life to rebuild, a new chapter to write. And this time, I was writing it on my own terms. Leaving Lake Tahoe that night, I felt a wave of relief mixed with uncertainty. I was free from Margaret's manipulation and Daniel's betrayal, yet my future was a blank slate. The life I had built, the dreams I had cherished, all were shattered by their deceit. As I drove back to Napa Valley to collect my belongings, questions about my next steps loomed large. The estate, once a sanctuary, now felt cold and empty. Walking through its grand halls, I was struck by how much I had sacrificed for a love that wasn't real. Daniel wasn't there, and for that I was grateful. I didn't want more tearful goodbyes or empty apologies. In my old room, I packed what mattered most: my culinary notebooks, treasured photos, and a few personal items. Standing in the kitchen one last time, I ran my fingers across the counters, recalling the meals I had lovingly prepared. This had been my solace, my domain, but it was time to let go. Before leaving, I left a note for Daniel, not out of anger, but for closure. Daniel, I loved you with everything I had. I believed in us, in the life we could have built together. But love isn't enough when trust is broken. You and your mother took something from me that can never be replaced. I hope you find a way to live with what you've done and learn to be better. But I won't wait for that. I'm leaving to rebuild my life, and I ask you not to follow me. This is goodbye, Sophia. I walked out without looking back. Over the next few weeks, I stayed in a small rental cottage on the outskirts of Napa Valley, far removed from the Williams family. Modest though it was, it felt like mine. I immersed myself in cooking, not for anyone else but for myself. It became my therapy, a way to heal the wounds left behind. One morning, while flipping through an old cookbook, inspiration struck. I could write my own story. I began weaving my journey into a memoir, blending my experiences with recipes that symbolized different moments: bittersweet pastries, fiery soups, comforting stews. Writing became a catharsis, and as the months passed, bitter to better, a recipe for healing took shape. Lisa, my closest ally since the night at Lake Tahoe, kept me updated on Margaret and Daniel. Margaret's life has fallen apart, she said during one call. The family turned against her, and she's facing legal action for what she did to you. Hearing this brought some closure. Margaret, who once seemed untouchable, was being held accountable. When I asked about Daniel, Lisa sighed. He's struggling, lost his job, and his reputation is in shambles. He talks about you sometimes, wishing he could undo everything. I felt a twinge of pity, but knew his pain was the consequence of his choices. The day I finished my memoir was the first day I felt truly free. Pouring my grief, anger, and hope onto its pages brought clarity. To my surprise, a publisher loved the manuscript and saw it as a story of resilience and empowerment. When the book was published, it resonated deeply with readers, especially women who had faced betrayal and manipulation. Letters poured in, thanking me for sharing my journey. For the first time in years, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Months later, at a book signing in Napa Valley, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Your book saved me," she said. "I was in a toxic marriage, and your story gave me the courage to leave." Her words moved me to tears. My pain had transformed into a beacon of hope for others. As for Margaret and Daniel, I occasionally heard about them but never reached out. Margaret was convicted for poisoning me, and Daniel led a quiet, isolated life. I harbored no hate, only indifference. They belonged to a past I had left behind. Today, I've built a life of freedom and fulfillment. I opened a small restaurant where every dish reflects my journey, a reminder that even the bitterest experiences can lead to something beautiful. This is my story, not of defeat but triumph. I am Sophia Williams, and I have risen from the ashes of betrayal to create a life that is truly mine.